Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the beginning of Chatham House's Centenary Week. Not quite the way, obviously, we had thought about kicking it off when we started this year back in January, but nonetheless, a year that is going to be all that much more different as a result of COVID-19 and very much more different going forward as well. So what I would like to say, first of all, is a huge thanks to all of those individuals who've taken the time to join us this week, but most importantly to all of my think tank colleagues who've come and joined us today for this first of our Centenary Week events. I'm thrilled that everyone's here and that we're able to have this discussion. I was just saying that I apologize, we won't be able to do justice to all of the topics we're going to be covering, or necessarily to all of the great people who've joined us today as well. But this is an important time and an important opportunity for us to be able to get together and do the most important thing for a think tank, which is have a discussion amongst all of our colleagues about how they're coping with this incredibly complex world at the moment. And I'm thrilled. I'm not going to introduce each think tank person as I go along in advance, because we've got a huge number of people who've joined us, and I want to say a big thank you to them. I know how busy they are and how many of these meetings they find they have to join every day. But what we've decided to do is do a little bit of a breakdown and have a conversation amongst my 14 colleagues here about some of the biggest issues taking place in international affairs, which includes the new geopolitical environment we're in, the prospects for multilateral and regional cooperation, the more polarized national politics, and a bit on sustainability in the global economy. Just touch on each of those topics with a number of my colleagues. I would say here that we really want to talk about the perspective from think tanks and the perspective from your role as directors of think tanks. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts about how you're coping, like we are at Chatham House, with this very complex environment. It's ironic, having been founded in 1920, that there are so many echoes of the 20s now in the 2020s, and one we did not expect, which is the echo, of course, of the COVID and the pandemic that took place, the unfortunately named for the Spanish flu back in that particular period, adding to all of the risks. So I'm going to kick off with some discussion about how think tanks are managing this much more tense geopolitical environment. And I'm going to start in particular with John Hamre, the president of CSIS in Washington. We're starting with John just because I felt it was important to get a perspective from inside Washington at this time. Most importantly also, John was my former boss, so I kind of feel an obligation to turn to him first and hear his viewpoints. But John, I think if you could just give us 2 or 3 minutes, really just a taster of what it's like right now, leading research, leading a think tank at a time where we seem to be getting an echoes of a rising geopolitical contest between the US and China, and the kind of decisions and choices that's posing to you as the CEO of CSIS in Washington. Over to you, John.
Thank you, and congratulations to you and Chatham House. You've done such a brilliant job, and makes me so proud. Congratulations. You know, it's obvious to everybody in the world that we're going through great chaos in the United States now because of both the COVID pandemic and the George Floyd murder. I think, but underlying both, there is a common dimension, and that is that the federal government is becoming weaker and weaker. It has less capacity to address problems because of the way the partisanship has become so brittle. And at the same time, policy innovation is now moving rather dramatically away from Washington to the private sector and to state and local government. Now, this is a challenge for us, obviously, because our historic model has been to work in Washington, work with the federal government. And so if policy innovation really is going to move dramatically, it's an interesting problem. It's also, we're entering into, finally, the post-Cold War era. I think the last 20 years have really still been part of it. We're the post-Cold War era, but this is not going to be so much a geopolitical competition as a geoeconomic competition. So for us, it means we have to shift the way we think about problems in foreign policy away from our traditional framework, which is thinking about how the State Department and the Defense Department works. It's much more working with industry. It's much more working with private sector. So we're shifting fairly dramatically. The great challenge, of course, is how does the liberal regulated capitalisms survive against state capitalism? And how do we push back in a way without bifurcating the global international order? That's the central challenge we're working through.
Sean, just one very quick follow-up. Arnold Toynbee, I was looking back, somebody mentioned this morning, in fact, that he gave a speech and an article in International Affairs at Chatham House back in right at the end of 38, 39, and you could see at that point that Chatham House was caught between groups who were saying you cannot advocate, a return to another conflict. In their case, it was the return to a World War I, repeat to World War II, and others who were strongly against appeasement said this is a time to stand up and be counted. And you could see Arnold Toynbee, Director of Research, literally admitted it, getting pulled in two directions on his board, amongst the members. Are you feeling any of that in Washington right now?
Well, that shows up in the debate over whether President Trump has abandoned traditional values as part of American foreign policy. That's how it shows up here. And I would say that, it divides roughly the way people divide on Trump generally. 60% of Americans feel that the value foundation of foreign policy should be strengthened, sustained and strengthened. And 40% are saying we should pull back, we've been taken advantage of, et cetera. It is the backdrop to this, but the real change is that the federal government is weaker, and it's going to be weaker, but I think what you're seeing is the way that the change is occurring right now in America. It's coming from corporations putting pressure on politicians, and the politicians are buckling. It is amazing what's happening. So this is a time of really profound change, and we think tanks. We're going to be in the front of it because corporations need help. State governments need help. So we're busier than ever.
Well, thanks, John, for those comments. Let me turn now and go right around the world to Beijing, to Feng Zhongping, Vice President of the China Institutes for Contemporary International Relations, KICR, which is one of the most highly regarded think tanks in China. Maybe I could pose a similar question to you, Zhongping, if I may, which is, how are you working in the think tank space, advising government? I don't think there's the same problem in Beijing that John Hamre was describing in Washington. In other words, in Beijing, still very much the government remains at the center of all decision making. How are you finding the demand for your advice? Is it changing under this much more intense geoeconomic contest, as John Hamre was describing it to you? Over to you, Zhongping.
Thank you, Robin. Let me start by also saying many congratulations to Chatham House, to you and to your colleagues. It is the right time for us, indeed, to do some, think tank people, to do some deep reflections. John mentioned the situation in the United States. As a think tank, a lot of people in China are deeply worried about the, the talks of the so-called new Cold War, or someone called Cold War 2.0 or 1.5. I think my message is when people are talking about the new Cold War, we missed one voice. We missed the voice of Europe, voice from the European countries. My argument is, we need to let the European colleagues to understand. Actually, Europeans can have their position can actually have an important impact on this world. European position is important because it can accelerate this so-called World War, but at the same time, it can also, reduce the scale of this scenario. So, and there's another argument I think, as a think tank, is we need to think about the lessons we learned both in Europe, in the United States, in China from the 21st century. I followed the European affairs in the past 20 years. I think the biggest lesson Europe has learned from the First World War and the Second World War is we need to build up some multilateral institutions to reduce the fear among each other, to gradually build up, establish some trust. And the lessons we learned in China from the 21st century, I think two. One is, China needs to become an independent power in the world. That's the lessons we learned from the past history, 100 accumulation. The second biggest lesson we learned is opening up to the world, especially opening up to the developed world. What does this mean? These two lessons, European lessons and Chinese lessons, mean for today's world. I think we need both China and Europe as a think tank people. We need to let the governments to understand how important to have some globally multilateral institutions in order to reduce the tensions. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one very quick follow-up question to you as well, though. To what extent do you find you are able in KICA, as in other the big think tanks in Beijing, how much is government listening to the think tanks right now? I'm sure, I know you're an experienced analyst, you'll be warning about the risks of escalation of bad conflict. Are you finding that the government is listening to think tanks, or when you have a more geopolitical environment, do they tend to listen to themselves? An easy question for you to answer from Beijing.
I tried my best to publish some articles in order for them to read the newspapers, for example. And also, important to have workshops like this. Okay, from time to time, I saw people from the think tank, decision-making circles, they also participate in the meetings like this. So we certainly have some, influence on people's thinking.
That's good to know. Well, look, you turned out by throwing the big challenge, interestingly, I thought, to Europe, as I was asking you a question about China. And conveniently, the next on my list already was Natalie Tocci, the director of EI, the Istituto Affari Italiano, so the Italian Institute for International Affairs. And I must say that, Natalie, we're thrilled you'd be with us. I didn't know if you expected to be thrown the question that somehow you were meant to, and Europe was meant to help resolve the situation. But how are you finding this more contested geoeconomic and geopolitical world? I find that the debates I've been listening to, there's been a real heating up of the sense that we are entering a more competitive phase. It might be geoeconomic, as John Hamre said, but how are you finding this in Italy, and how are you coping with it as the head of EI?
Well, I think, Robin, that in many respects, the sort of period, the crisis that we're going through has clarified a number of things that have been sort of, bubbling away under the surface for some time. So, we've known for some time that we were moving away from a unipolar structure. We weren't quite know what was the structure that we were moving towards. Well, now we know that. So we know that it is a G2 world. And on top of that, we know, and it may be a G2 world that is the overarching, the sort of overlay within which different power centers operate, but that is the big global overlay. We also know, unfortunately, that this G2 world is a conflictual one. Now, whether it's a new Cold War or not, well, it's obviously going to be a different one. Hopefully, it will not be a hot war, so hopefully it will be a Cold War in a sense of sorts, but it will be a different one because, firstly, it is not a multidimensional sort of conflict in the way in which the old Cold War was primarily. And because, so it is more multidimensional, which means that it's more difficult to regulate, which increases its, the risk and the dangers to it. But on the positive, it is also a more interdependent Cold War. I mean, the interdependencies that exist between the United States and China are obviously infinitely higher than those that existed between the Soviet Union and the United States. So I think as think tanks, as European think tanks, well, firstly, we're sort of called on to try and understand, basically, what is the context that we're operating in. And as I said, the picture has started clarifying, but only to the extent that it's kind of clarified the questions that we have to address. I think there's a second big aspect, which also reminds me very much of what the history of my own institute was during the Cold War, which is in a sense, relational, a connecting function that as European think tanks we can play within this new environment. I wasn't around back then, but I was the think tank that brought to the United States the first group of Italian communist parliamentarians. Back in the late 1970s, and sort of thinking back at that kind of sort of event, and in a sense the sort of political role that we played as think tanks back then, which was a political role that somehow got erased after the end of the Cold War. Well, I'm just wondering, also sort of picking up the suggestion that Feng Songping was making, whether there is that relationship aspect in sort of connecting the dots that we can play. And then third and finally, obviously, there's the advice question. And here I think that as Europeans, we're basically left to understand how to position ourselves in a G2 confrontational world in which our aim, let's be very frank, is not that of being equidistant. We will not be equidistant between the United States and China, but at the same time, we do want to have an equilibrium, and we want to make sure that that equilibrium is determined by Europeans themselves, and that we're not forced or coerced into taking one position or another. And that kind of advice, which, in my view, really boils down to what do we mean by autonomy and how do we achieve it, how do we articulate it, is, I think, again, sort of the big piece of advice, which obviously then has all sorts of specific meanings, whether we're talking about the economy or digital or climate or security, but it's the big box of tricks in the sense that we're sort of left to untangle.
Thank you. That's very into a point. We won't be equidistant, but we do want to define our equilibrium, I think is a very neat way of putting, of course, Europe as usual, trying to have its cake and eat it, but like the Brits as well. But I think a very important point to have raised. And I'm wondering, I'm going to turn to Yoichi Funabashi now. We're jumping all the way over to Tokyo, chairman of the Asia Pacific Initiative, but somebody known very actively in the think tank, having also created the Rebuild Japan Initiative before this current one. Yoichi, I sometimes wonder whether Japan is in a similar difficult position to the one that Europeans find themselves in. China, your neighbor, and as John Hamre was saying earlier, at a time when corporate voices are bringing more and more pressure to bear on governments, where does that leave think tanks in Japan, where I think appreciating the risks that China poses geoeconomically and politically is understood, but the interdependence is massive. How are you handling that with your Asia Pacific initiative, Yoichi? Over to you.
Yeah, I really commend your strong leadership, and thank you very much once again. I think we really have to get real. We have to do a reality check. Whether we like or not, we actually are now entering into a new Cold War in geoeconomic terms. We are not in Cold War in military, no. But I think that increasingly that we are witnessing that the liberal rule-based international order, a multilateral one, are being challenged from all fronts, and during which that economic coercion and also expanding sphere of influence and technological hegemonic struggle, they are all now here. So At our institute, we just established the Institute of Geoeconomics Studies at API by inviting Professor Jun Murai, a legendary scholar in Japan, specializing in internet and AI and 5G and the others. Because that's, I think that what is unfolding here is that the intensifying the geoeconomic struggle, particularly in digital area. So I think that is very much important. Also, I think that is very crucial for middle powers, like some European countries and Japan, Australia, Korea. I think to really pool their resources and exchange views and notes and how to really cope with these new challenges, particularly geoeconomic challenges. For instance, in this case of COVID-19 crisis, I think it is very much important for us middle powers and think tanks, particularly in middle powers, to cooperate, to compare notes and how, and to draw the best practices and good practices of how to cope with that, this crisis. And, given that lack of international cooperation to cope with that coronavirus crisis, WHO and the others, they are dysfunctional. So I think that civil society and think tanks are very much now should be expected to play an important role to address these issues.
Thank you, Ichi. Very clearly put. As you said, we've got to get real. You said we're in the geoeconomic Cold War. It's happened already. And the digital space being one where it's most actively seen. I'm going to keep moving through my colleagues here because I've said I was so lucky to have 14 think tank heads with us that if I don't keep moving, somebody's going to drop off the end, and I don't want anyone to drop off the end. So I want to just let my colleagues know that I'm going to move straight forward because I think there's a good link here to the situation being faced by Michael Fullilove and Australia, because I think there was a comment there about middle powers that we heard from Yoichi Funabashi, that there is a need for those countries that perhaps find themselves squeezed in this geoeconomic conflict between perhaps a values and a historical connection to the United States, to what was called the West, but at the same time cannot escape the geoeconomic reality of the world's largest soon-to-be economy in China. And certainly if you're in the Asia-Pacific region, finding that geoeconomic weight really pulls you very close into its orbit. And I'm just wondering, Michael, if you're there at the executive director of the Lowy Institute, whether you could share a little bit how you are coping. Is there a new regionalism emerging, or maybe clusters of countries that are trying to find their way to navigate? And is that something that the Lowy Institute is exploring in particular? How are you coping with this very brutal political debate, but at the same time, this desire to try to find a way forward? Michael, over to you.
Well, thank you, Robin. And let me join John and others in wishing Chatham House happy birthday. I think the scale of this event shows the global reach, almost the imperial reach of Chatham House. But I do want to compliment you, Robin, on being a very effective director and an excellent colleague. And I wish you well in everything except cricket, if I can put it that way, Robin. In terms of the regionalisation and the globalisation, Australia used to suffer under the tyranny of distance, and now we suffer from the predicament of proximity, where wealth and power have moved eastwards towards us. And so the old model of sending troops to conflicts in the Middle East as a down payment on an alliance is over. This is really the central front of geopolitics is in our part of the world. And we're right in the middle of the US-China rivalry because the United States is our old ally and China is our most important economic partner. Let me say two things. First of all, how does Australia react, and then how does an Australian think tank react? Australia reacts in two dimensions. First of all, by building thicker connections in the region. And even last week, Australia announced a major defence strategic update more defense spending, much more lethal deterrent capability, many more really repivoting the Australian military towards our region rather than those sorts of global coalition operations. But at the same time, retaining those links to the global ally and building links with other countries around the world who are all confronting a similar challenge. And I'd point out to that those two dimensions operate at the think tank level too. We are, as the Lowy Institute, we are doing more with our colleagues, many colleagues on this call and others, with Samir Saran at ORF, with colleagues at CSIS in Indonesia, in Tokyo, in Port Moresby, in regional capitals. We are working heavily on Asia. Asia touches every piece of work we do. And yet at the same time, we are trying to do more with global allies, more with institutes in the United States, and also more with with institutes in like-minded countries. So for example, for many years, we've been involved in the Council of Councils, which Richard Haas, who's on this call, instituted. But we are also doing more with other sorts of institutions. So for example, a few weeks ago, I hosted a meeting of the D10 Strategy Forum, which is something the Atlantic Council has started, with foreign policy planners and think tank directors from 10 major democratic countries. So as foreign policy, as the diplomatic geometry is changing, think tank geometry is changing too. And we are trying to find more allies. As Funabashi-san said, compare notes with other colleagues about how we deal with the China challenge. And just to finish on that point, Robin, I think the challenge here is where we have to cooperate with China where our interests overlap, but we need to be able to push back against China when our interests diverge. And that is the common challenge that is felt not only in Australia, not only in Tokyo or in Seoul, but in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Brasilia, in Buenos Aires, all around the world. We're all grappling with that challenge. So I think we can help each other think it through.
Very good points. And I think, as you said, the changing geography, in a way, of think tanks. Fortunately, as we all know, there are many more institutions around than there were in the 30s and those early years when think tanks had to grapple with these problems before. But hopefully we've thickened up the soup a little bit of ideas and the lessons learned and the mistakes not to be repeated from the past. Pei Kak-soon, you're president of the Sejong Institute in Seoul in South Korea. I thought actually quite a good mix, because I think, although not mentioned immediately by Michael a second ago, I know that those kind of regional linkages between countries that share values, I think Michael used the like-minded term, and I think on this D10 group, there's some suggestions, certainly by the British government and others, that South Korea would be one of the countries that would be involved in maybe a G10. A G7 that expands itself out a little bit. Could you just share your thoughts on how you're coping with this at the Sejong Institute in Seoul? Hak-soon, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Robin. I would say that the British made two great contributions to the humankind: the English literature and the Chatham House rule. I thought you'd laugh or smile. I made this joke. This joke is of my own creation, and I did this as a way of congratulating your contribution to the past 100 years. Sort of going back to the theme we are talking about. I think the Korea, not only Korea, but also the Sejong Institute has quite the same problems as my colleague at the Lowy Institute pointed out. But if you look at the problem from Seoul, definitely regionalism, deeper regional integration would help in overcoming the negative aspects of divided geopolitics we are suffering from these days. But in this region, East Asia and Northeast Asia, we have very strong opposing sub-power blocks, clearly dividing the integration in this region. We have China, Russia, and North Korea on the one hand, and United States, Japan, and South Korea, and Taiwan on the other. And but more importantly, we try to we have problem in still have not gotten out of the trap, mental trap, or obsession trap, if you will, in which we almost automatically try to understand non-traditional security issues in the light of traditional security issues. For instance, COVID-19, this is a non-security, human non-security issue, and it's a human security issue. But the United States and China, for instance, and Japan and Korea as well, almost instantaneously try to interpret it as a in the concept and in the policy of, in the context of traditional security issues. So there's lack of cooperation between us. And so I think one thing we have to do, regardless of whether we are talking about how to overcome the negative effects of divided geopolitics or the implications of deeper regional integration as an answer to how best to navigate among this security environment, we all have to make sure that all those human man-made disasters, including COVID-19, and should be very seriously discussed in our effort to whatever we do for the benefit of the humankind.
Thank you very much. That was perfectly heard, Hak-soon, your comments there. This idea that even issues that are not connected automatically to geoeconomic context or geopolitics, like COVID-19, instantaneously, as you said, become areas of geopolitical conflict. This is going to create dilemmas for think tanks that try to separate out the functional issues from the geopolitical, and they're all going to get meshed together, as John Hamre said at the beginning, in a more geoeconomic environment. We can't separate out the economic from the political at the moment. Let me turn then, just to keep things going, because I want to make sure I give everyone a good chance. You've all been so disciplined with your time that we're actually on time. Thomas Gomard in Paris, the director of IFRI, and it does remind me, if I could just throw a bit of Chatham House history in as well, that I'd say tragically in a way, two of our most illustrious scholars in the last, this side of the Second World War, if they don't mind me putting it that way, William Wallace and Helen Wallace, two of the people who really championed the idea of the UK forming part of a regional organization to strengthen their power, obviously are living to see the day where that has now been lost. And I'm wondering, Thomas, how optimistic are you in France, in Paris, that Europe will be able to come together, provide some of the strategic autonomy, to use the terminology that's been used, to deal with this much more complex environment? Thomas, how are you advising this from Paris?
Well, on that I am simultaneously pessimistic and optimistic. I am pessimistic for all the reasons we debate all the time during think tankers, about European strategic autonomy. I have no time to elaborate, but more deeply, I am pessimistic for our job, given the evolution of expertise. The fact that now expertise is directly attacked by politicians. We are all facing sort of little Trumps, on each European political scenes. And I think that that's something very challenging for all think tanks. In France, in particular, we enter a presidential campaign, as you know. I am also very optimistic for our job, given the fact that there is a huge social demand for geopolitics and for geoeconomics. For instance, in the French education system, it has been decided that geopolitics will be taught before A-levels, for instance, which is, reflecting something. That leads me to a second point, Robin, and I should have started with that. It's to congratulate, of course, Chatham House, because with CFR, you invented the job of think tanks, you know. And there is this late reaction on continental Europe to create their own think tanks. You mentioned, you know, IFRI, there was before IFRI the CEPE, Centre d'études et de politique étrangère, and there was fantastic job made between CEPE and Chatham House just before the Second World War, for instance. So we are in this history, and this history, once again, was invited by you, by CFR, and was very important, I think, you know, in the transatlantic relations. That leads me to my third point. I think that for us, and it's also a way to respond directly to your question, what will be the most challenging thing will be to combine the global narrative, the regional narrative, and I do believe there won't be European strategic autonomy without European narrative, with the national narratives. And think tanks like ours, I think, are capable to act, to operate, and to link these three levels. In terms now to finish about, you know, the main challenges regarding European strategic autonomy, I see two things. The very first one is to be able to produce expertise and piece of advice regarding the current fight for technological supremacy between China and the US and its consequences for Europe. That's a very big issue, obviously. And second, also to explain that the climate warming is something I think more and more challenging for Europeans. I have no time to elaborate on the Green Deal, but it's also a way for me to say that during the Cold War, you know, many think tanks were the home for, I would say, so-called defense intellectuals. And I do think that we will become more and more home for, I would say, environmental intellectuals. It seems to me highly important because the politicians on that very often are not very reasonable. And I think that we should work on that. Let me finish by saying you, Robin, personally, my thanks, because you were one of those who supported me when I became director, and it's a good day for me to be there for your celebration. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and I was pleased to be able to be with you for your 50th anniversary in Paris, in that wonderful location of the Sorbonne. I think it was last year. Seems like a whole generation ago almost. So I'm delighted you were able to return the compliment and be here today. Very much appreciated, and best to you and Thierry and all of your colleagues at IFRI in Paris. You mentioned a very important point at the end there about this need to focus on the environmental, the climate diplomacy, which is bubbling underneath the surface there, more than under the surface, but even at this COVID-19, this moment of geopolitics. And I'm proud to say, I think I'm allowed to do this in our Centenary, our largest area of research at Chatham House has been for at least 10 years now and continues to be in the energy environment, but particularly environment and climate space, and over resource management in particular with our Hoffman Center and our energy, environment and resources team. So a big shout out to them, and I know they're incredibly busy with work, and we look forward to collaborating with all of you on coming up with good ideas in that space going forward. I did want to shift, and I'm just going to keep moving through the agenda here, because that way we'll give everyone a good opportunity to intervene, as all the others have done here, into this difficulty of dealing with the more polarized world that everyone has described. Each of the speakers we've had so far has been talking about the complexity as a think tank of dealing in an environment where expertise is no longer as appreciated, if it doesn't sit inside a particular narrative, where nationalism is on the rise. And I remember that a lot of the biggest Chatham House studies in the 30s, there was a whole series on the rise of nationalism then. It feels like we should be, as we were about 5-6 years ago, doing even more in that space today. And I'm wondering, Richard, if I could turn to Richard Haas first, because Richard, you are the Council on Foreign Relations, but you are, like Chatham House, our sister institute, founded out of the same dinner at the Hotel Majestic back in May 1919. You have retained through your membership, but also I think expanded a much more national dialogue through CFR. And I'm just wondering if, I mean, say whatever you want on the geopolitics, but if you could just give us a window into how you've been adapting CFR to deal with the more complex national dialogue about America's place in the world and the kind of role the think tanks play. Over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Robin. And I expect there are days that we regret that we did not become that joint institute that was envisioned a century ago. But seems to me you're doing just fine without us.
We'd love to share a bit of your endowment, but apart from that, it's fine.
Well, fair, duly noted. Like on the geopolitics, I just say one thing, which is I think this is an important moment for think tanks, which is that for so much of our careers, particularly those of us who are relatively ancient, we were working during the Cold War. You woke up every day. You had a pretty good sense of what would greet you. I spent too many years thinking about warheads on launchers and all that. And now this really is a moment for first order thinking, whether it's about US, China, whether it's about global issues, the structure of the international system, what we mean by order. So, and by and large, the academy has opted out because it's too theoretical and too quantitative and so forth. So I really do think this is an important moment for organizations like these, which is to tackle these big issues. There really is almost a palpable sense of living in history, and to both come forward with the analysis and come forward with some prescription. And I think we're on the hook for both. So I really do think this is a time to think big and think not just day to day, but also medium term and longer term. Governments are unable to generate, for the most part, that kind of creativity. Again, the academy is largely opted out. So I really do think we have both an opportunity and obligation to fill that space, which is in some ways a natural segue to what you asked me. Yeah, we are operating in a hyper-politicized environment. We're also operating in an environment where we can't take anything for granted in terms of what people know, because I'll speak of my own country, the education is so inadequate in these areas. You can graduate from virtually any higher education institution in America and be functionally illiterate about the world if you choose to. There's tons of information available on the internet, but there's no one there to edit it or authenticate it. There's no one there to guarantee that people get a comprehensive exposure to anything. The same is true of our cable television, our radio. So I think we're operating information. We're both flooded with information and it's wildly inadequate at one and the same time. So one of the things we do, I think, need to do is be a provider of information that's comprehensive and accurate. We've done a lot of work on what we would call explainers or basics, essentially putting out educational material because the schools aren't doing it, we're doing it, to put it bluntly at the council. I think in terms of dealing with the politics, the partisan and the divided landscape, one is to make sure that we all always offer up a range of views, and not just for the sake of offering up a range of, but a range of informed views. And this is true, I think, of who works on our staffs, like our fellows, who we invite to speak at meetings, who in our case we would invite to publish in foreign affairs. That it's got to be a range. You've got to fight pigeonholing, I think, and just speaking to your own particular constituency. It puts pressure on money, I understand that. In a funny sort of way, it's often easier to fund if you're predictable and more ideological. And I would say, like, as is often the case, resist temptations and think about multiple funding sources in terms of type, but also directions. It's a challenge, but I think it's a challenge worth it. I'm a great believer, as you know, in not having official sources of funding from governments. I think there's a sense of that. I'd just say two other things in dealing with this environment. I don't want to go on for long. One is to put your stuff out on a range of media outlets. Like one, so in the United States, it means, yes, you go on MSNBC or CNN, but you should also go on Fox. and you should publish, or this radio show, or this newspaper. I think there is an argument for, again, not just speaking to the particular choir that you like. And then lastly, we've spent an awful lot of calories thinking about who do we reach. So in a country of 325 million people, we only have 5,000 members. That doesn't, it's not a significant percentage. So we've targeted students, faculty, and administrators in high schools and universities. We've targeted the people who give sermons every week in churches and mosques and synagogues. We've targeted governors, mayors. We have targeted journalists. What all these groups have in common is, in some ways, they're force multipliers. Every one of these people has access to lots of other people, obviously business leaders, labor leaders, besides Congress and the executive branch. So besides the obvious governmental or colleagues, which are the kind of constituencies I think think tanks deal with naturally. We all want to influence our governments. We all want to influence one another. I do think we need to look at who in society are the drivers of the conversation. And many more people show up in church every Sunday than show up at our events. Many more people are in classrooms every week. And I think that we have to make more of an effort to get beyond those who opt into the debate, those who are self-joiners, who are, one of the things I tell, and I'll stop with this, I say it's fine to speak to world affairs groups, but it's actually much more important to go speak to Rotary clubs. Try to get beyond the people who are self-defining and self-joining the foreign policy, international relations conversation, and think about getting out to a broader citizenry. And I think for all of us, that's, it's not either or, by the way. We should continue to do what I would call the inside game, the more establishment elite thing that all of us do. But I believe we have to spend part of our time and resources on reaching constituencies that are not traditionally part of the foreign policy conversation. And I think in Europe, the question of Brexit and votes like that make that point. For better and for worse, these are now popular subjects. And I just think that we have to now, we can't just be elite or establishment organizations.
Very well made points, Richard. Thank you for that. And also giving the flavor of what specifically you've been doing at CFR. And I remember one of my predecessors as director used the expression about the rifle shot approach, which was so in vogue or necessary back when, but now we've moved to the position, as you said, where you've got to kind of enlarge the aperture. I liked your point about informed views, because I think what we struggle with in many think tanks is involving a diverse view and people who disagree with you. You sometimes wonder, are those informed disagreements, or are they just plain disagreement for an ideological reason? And trying to navigate that one is incredibly difficult. Thank you very much, Richard, for that. Just as everyone's been so good on time, I'm going to jump to South Africa, to Elizabeth Sideropoulos. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us there, the Chief Executive of the South Africa Institute of International Affairs, which is a sister institute of Chatham House from our, I think Michael called it, our imperial days. Maybe colonial was the right term slightly to have used from that historical moment. But Elizabeth, great you could join us there from South Africa. Could you just share a word or two, because we know, talk about polarized political environments. Obviously, South Africa is still having to grapple with the heritage of an incredibly polarized political environment. How are you managing this issue from your standpoint? Elizabeth, over to you.
Great. Well, Robin, let me also add my congratulations to Chatham House for its centenary from the younger sister, which is a young 86-year-old. We turned 86 in May this year. So, and it's great to be able to join you, and also to say that certainly over the last a few years, we've also really developed a very good engagement with your Africa program at Chatham House, apart from the history of cooperation over many years. Just a couple of points. I think the first issue, and this is not only about South Africa, but also more broadly about the continent, is that while we are facing a much more polarized environment, the relationship between the primary constituency of think tanks, the policy community, and think tanks on the continent has always been very difficult. It's been very difficult because they've been seen as part of a broader community of civil society organizations, which, as the continent, many countries on the continent were democratizing, were seen as almost being in opposition to the government. And in the absence also of a strong opposition within parliament, and this also goes for South Africa, by the way, think tanks and other civil society actors almost became that opposition. And so that's the milieu in which we have been operating. Also to say that think tanks on the continent, and to some extent this mirrors partly South Africa, but not entirely, obviously have been relatively weak, haven't had the kind of strong policy engagement, and particularly also in international relations, which of course is now much broader than it was, say, 50, 60 years ago, not just looking at foreign affairs and defense, but obviously covering a whole range of issues. So they are coming, into this highly polarized environment already on the back foot. Having said that, a couple of points which will, I think, echo to some extent what Richard has been saying. I think the first point that we at SIA and in South Africa are recognizing and trying to act on increasingly is the fact that the policymakers are not the only audience and the most important audience. That in fact, policy making these days is happening as much as a result of what is happening out on the street, or through actors that are the loudest. And so you as a think tank that comes in with a reasoned, rational approach is sometimes shouted down and shouted out. And that I think also reflects a lot of the points that many colleagues have already made. So what does that mean for how we engage? I think a couple of things. Firstly, clearly that it is about broadening your reach. And here, thinking about many of the actors that are much more activist in the way in which they engage with policymakers. So civil society organizations, we as an institute, through our work on governance in the continent, have engaged with a number of civil society actors who are involved in governance initiatives within their own countries, and sort of bringing in some of our research dimensions into that. That's one avenue. A second avenue relates to how we have built up the way in which we engage with youth in high schools, but also over the last several years really built up a cohort of young people in universities, largely in universities, who are engaging as youth on the challenges that both have a local as well as a regional and global dimension. And so they have created youth policy committees on gender-based violence, on climate change, on issues around how youth can really participate meaningfully in policy engagements, not tick box exercises where the government says, I've invited 5 young people and they sat at the table and they made an observation. It's about much more than that. And so that's another way of also sort of not only broadening, but going into communities that would traditionally not be part of the remit of, an elitist foreign policy institute. And perhaps 2 last points. One is the importance in this highly polarized environment, and in South Africa we have the overlay, of course, of our history of apartheid, to really be able to create platforms that are not always politically correct, platforms that bring together different views, that allow these views to be properly debated. So the issue of informed debate, that's one of our taglines. But that also then bring into those discussions actually evidence-based research. So it's not about everybody having having an opinion, but that opinion is simply driven by emotion rather than facts. And lastly, I think we need to, and this is a critique of, I think, think tanks in South Africa and probably within the continent as well, we always say we need to be focusing on over-the-horizon thinking. And I think a lot of the time we are not. Partly because of our circumstances, which means you're constantly trying to find and chase the money. But we need to have our eyes and ears open and out there. And I think the means of engagement with a broader community, as well as having a much more diverse group of people internally and with whom you engage externally, I think would provide that kind of input into being much more relevant.
Elizabeth, thank you very much, especially your very interesting point about think tanks almost being seen as the opposition, you know, as such an arm of civil society in many of the countries across Africa is a really important observation, which probably applies to a few other countries as well. And obviously your comments there, you come from such a young continent, unlike many of the other think tanks that we've heard from who are grappling with the other end of the spectrum. And you've got a whole massive challenge of engagement, which must be actually very thrilling and kind of dynamic, which is excellent in that sense. Let me turn to Carlos Leal, because we're literally going all the way from South Africa now to Brazil, the president of the Getulio Vargas Foundation. Carlos, you know, for better or for worse, Brazil is thought of as a place with now some pretty polarized political debate as well. Presidents who get impeached actually do get impeached and out of office, and a very conflictual environment. How are you, the leader of a very large and highly respected academic institution and think tank, how are you coping with this environment? Over to you, Carlos.
The first thing is that I don't talk.
It's all right. There's only a few million people listening to you on this. It's only being recorded.
This is very important. You see, Brazil has had a long tradition of non-confrontational politics. Recently, we have left that tradition. But it is most likely that we will come back to it in the medium term. It's part of our institutional evolution. There are many things going on. This COVID crisis is not only a sanitary crisis. It is an economic crisis that was triggered because of confinement. But it is also a long-term crisis because of the push in digitalization. So we are going to have a lot of people unemployed, not because of confinement and its effects, but because of digitalization. On the other hand, it also means that instead of competing with other regions of the world with our average education, we will be competing with the average of a top part of our education against the average of a top part of other parts of the world. So many people are noticing that there are many opportunities. You see, the big thing about all these toys that we are using now, WebEx, Teams, Zoom, etc. It's the ecosystem that some of them have behind that allow you to process technologies much faster and much better. And we have an issue on productivity in this country, and this is going to change a lot of things. So if you have a danger of a crisis and an opportunity, it is a Brazilian tradition that we will get the opportunity and stop bickering. This will take a while, it's true. There are many factors for that. Recent past corruption is one of them. There are many people that are still very angry. But I think that things will move forward. You see, we have elections every 4 years for presidents, and put a delay of 2 years, we have elections every 4 years too for Congress, meaning both deputies and senators. So this is bound to move.
Yeah.
So the important thing right now is that your question was, can think tanks thrive in this environment? Yes, but you have to choose what thrive means to you. You can have short-term success in politics, might become a partidarian think tank, or you may start to look at more at things that have a long-term influence. Is a debt crisis? Is there going to be a world debt crisis within a year and a half from now? Countries have been printing money like mad. No one knows. So what does it mean for Brazil if the world standards starts changing? So we are looking at that. We are studying that. There are people interested on what we are studying, and we are taking the long-term view.
Sounds like the right approach to take. As you're echoing Richard's comment there about think tanks being able to take that longer perspective than governments are able to. Incredibly important point. Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you for bringing that.
Congratulations on your 100th birthday.
Thank you all the way from Brazil. Thank you so much for those remarks. I want to jump now back into Europe to Volker Perthes, because although I won't have a chance to catch many of the questions being put in the Q&A chat by people who are watching this this event online, but also as members adding questions, there was one very important one that jumped out at me, Volker, and I'm sorry to throw it to you, but I think it's a good segue slightly also to what Carlos was saying about the challenges our societies are facing. Volker Perthes in Berlin, were think tanks asleep at the wheel? Question. Did we spend too much time enjoying globalization, the great post-Cold War moment where we thought everything was fine? And now we've almost been creators of this more polarized national political environment because we were not warning against it. Volker, tough question, but you can handle it.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thanks for the last 100 years, and good luck for the next 100, and thanks for at least 30 years of intensive cooperation between our two organizations. Look, I would respectfully disagree with that being asleep at the wheel. I had the chance to look through what we did in our last 15 years because I'm preparing to handing over after 15 years to a new director here at SWP, and then you find out where you actually did all these warning things. What you never did, and I think we cannot do, is to say, look, this is going to happen. But what we can do is we can tell policymakers, deciders, that here are a couple of risks which we see, and you better get prepared for them. Or you better get prepared for risks as such. I mean, risk is sort of part of the normalcy with which you have to live, which you have to handle. And I think we weren't so bad here, relatively speaking. But to be more self-critical, I think sometimes we are collectively sort of very much of an in-group where we clap one another on our shoulders and say that we agree. We often do, and probably we should disagree a little bit more often, even between think tanks in different countries of the world, which makes it so important for me to tell some of our friends who say that we as think tanks in liberal democratic countries have to put up a fight for democracy. Well, as a citizen, I would say yes, but as a think tank, I would defend the necessity of a think tank to speak to those who are not like-minded and find out more about how others see the world. And sometimes that doesn't go down too well with some members of our political leadership, but I think it has to be explained, can be explained. Let me speak about sort of, which I think was a lead question for this group, sort of the fragmentation and polarization. Here, Germany is obviously in a different league than the US at the moment, or Brazil, or even South Africa. We do have our own right-wing populists in parliament, as everybody has in Europe. Since we are a publicly funded think tank, we get some fire, particularly from these right-wing populists or extremists, whatever you want to call them, asking in parliament, in parliamentary interpellations, why we use our money to speak positively about migration, for example. Now, that happens, but it is okay. At the same time, even those right-wing parties in parliament, as one only, they would take our advice if they want to know how the world is going. And I would say that generally, particularly over the crises of the last years, it's not only COVID, it's a whole unraveling of an order as we know it. Particularly in my country, there is generally more demand for sound expertise. And what may be a particular German feature is, since we are seeing that the United States is not there to lead as we knew it and as we found it very comfortable that it happened, there is more demand for expertise on geopolitics, on international relations, and there is a realization, okay, we have to know more, we have to do more, so at least we should have sound analysis. And for us, as a think tank, it's particularly important, particularly also because we are publicly funded, which in contrast to Richard, I would defend as a good thing to remain independent from certain vested interests, that you have to make clear that you're not the government spokespeople, that you differ from government opinion on a factual basis, that you are pluralistic in the research you do, and that you do, that's a very sort of ancient word, that you do your research sine ira et studio, as it's called in Latin, without hate, without prejudice, without a certain agenda. And then, and here I agree with almost all my colleagues, and Richard started that, but I put it in different words. I think our task has changed a little bit, because in the past, I would say, we have to speak truth to power. That's still true. Today, I guess we have to speak truth to the people much more than we used to do. And that means we usually use the 4 I's, because that I is the letter I, because that goes in English and in German. That means information, which the public needs, the public wants. It means interpretation about where we are in the world. It means ideas, that's mainly what governments, decision makers are asking for, but it also means irritation. And I think as think tanks, we should maintain our right and defend our right to irritate those who take the decisions a little bit from time to time.
Thank you, Volker. And that willingness not always to be popular, as you said, but to irritate. And right now, you also made the point about putting up the fight to be able to also to speak to the not like-minded, and that think tanks have a particular role to play, not to be following the crowd on these issues, but to be trying to create some of those bridges. And I think the wonderful group of people we've got here today is a symbol of that. So thank you very much for making those points. I've got 3 more of my colleagues I want to bring in now. I'm going to go straight into that group, because I can see we're already at 2:10, and this is meant to finish in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So everyone's been amazingly disciplined on their time. So thank you very much indeed for being so focused. I'm going to turn actually first to Samir Saran, and then go to Daniela, and then to Francisco Santibanez. But first to Samir Saran, who's the president of the Observer Research Foundation. Samir, I think you're probably in Mumbai. That's certainly where I've met you in the past. But Samir, you've talked a lot about the way technology is disrupting both economies, international politics, and I presume think tanks as well. I'll give that as your entry point, but any comments you'd like to share as well about this new environment for think tanks? Over to you, Samir. And host of the Raisina Dialogue, I should say as well, which is a wonderful gathering. Samir, over to you.
Thank you, Robin, and let me first congratulate you for a century in cricket terms. And while you prosper and continue to engage in public service as you have done for the last 100 years, both you and Michael should be prepared to lose in cricket, because that power center has certainly shifted.
I didn't cut him off. I'm not going to cut you off. You're allowed to. You can rib us on cricket if you want. Okay, go ahead.
No, but I was hearing my colleagues speak, and I guess there are 3 trends which are visible, which are implicated by technology, by globalization generally, and by the kind of politics we are engaging with today. The first, of course, I think someone used the word street. And I think that's the important term to engage with as think tanks today. Street consensus is more potent than elite consensus. And I think as soon as we can begin to reconcile with that, we become more effective institutions. It is people who need to be, like Volker was suggesting, engaged with, informed, learned from, and made partners in the progress that we seek. And there are two reasons for doing this. First, I think the takers on the street, and be it Berlin or Buenos Aires or New Delhi, and I'm in Delhi, not in Bombay, Robin, you would find that the affection, the romance around globalization is at its nadir. People are not buying into the global project anymore. It was much easier to sell the global ambitions, ideas, globalism, global projects for many of our institutions in the past, because globalization was seen to be doing good to many people and lifting many folks out of poverty, delivering prosperity, jobs, sustainability. Clearly that project has hit a road bump. And I don't think this is a political bump. I think, again, if we are true and honest, I think globalization has hit an economics bump. The economics is wrong. Inequality is stark. There is a life expectancy difference of 30 years between the top 10% households and the bottom 10% households. Right to life has been priced variably by globalization. And unless you can start responding to the principal equality that must be enshrined in an economic project, politics will get messy. And as the street consensus becomes more important, the space for you to engage in high politics is going to be restricted by immediate economics. And I think immediate economics requires urgent attention. Otherwise, big global projects will always tend to suffer. And that is in many ways also the design that we need to work with as think tanks. The second big question, of course, is that many of us have not made that transition where we can think about 21st century questions around technology and innovation and the fourth industrial revolution, because we still have a 20th century project to complete. We still have to complete schools and hospitals and power lines and roads and rural development initiatives. So we are, countries like ours, are at one level still engaged with 20th century debates where the role of the state was very different. They had an eminent domain. They used to give licenses. They used to give operating permissions. They used to have a different form and format. And we have to engage with the innovation century where the state has to be absent. The state has to allow space. The state has to allow complete freedom. So policy making in many parts of the world where we are grappling with both of these realities is even more complex. And then the streets that you need to walk are very different. Now, globalization may have English as its language, and Thomas, please forgive me, but domestic politics is fought in vernaculars. And I think think tanks, unless they can be multilingual, both in their thought and in their pronouncements, are going to struggle. Now, all of this is captured very nicely. These contradictions, these challenges, these different urges, these pulls and pressures are captured in your Twitter app on your phone or in any other social media that you inhabit. Technology allows and gives a microphone, a megaphone, a loudspeaker to everyone. Now, it breaches the boundaries between elite and street. It breaches the boundaries between opinion and analysis. It challenges the concept of purity of research with the legs of a catchy rhetorical idea. And I think in think tank terms, our principal ideal has to be to defend research. We have to defend research, but we have to be able to attach it to the lingua franca of the digital age. And I think our biggest challenge going ahead is going to be that how do you make long form research sexy? I'm sorry if I've offended anyone by using that term, but I think unless we can make long form sellable in bits and bytes, the digital world is going to ignore much of the produce. So that's one part. Second, I think think tanks have to shed the hypocrisy. Think tanks will, if you ask a think tanker 10 years ago, what should governments do? They will tell you decentralize, invest in big data, invest in AI, invest in everything that think tanks have never done. None of our think tanks have invested in the solutions we implore our governments to. I think now we have to be do tanks. We have to create the formats, the pilots, the incubators that can then become also an experiential center for governments and other stakeholders to embrace. So I think we have to quickly move into do tanks because the street wants more immediate response from the rather lethargic ecosystems that were built in the last century. And the final point before I end, I think I completely relate to what CFR is trying to do. And I think I've heard this earlier from Ambassador Haas as well. But I think by the time when I was growing up, my grandmother used to tell me about the rights and wrongs and principles and ideas and stories about our mythologies and stories about foreign lands. That used to be the age between 10 to 15 or 10 to 16. It's now the handset, the mobile phone that tells the kids that. By the time kids reach college, and by the time they reach their master's degree, when we start engaging with them, they've already made up their mind. I think we have to start engaging with a much younger constituency. If we don't go down to the schools, if we don't start engaging with a demography which is far different, we have lost the debate before even entering it. So I think the demographic challenge, both in terms of the two projects I mentioned, the 20th century and the 21st century, the language challenge, the age challenge, and of course, the global challenge. That how do we make globalization sexy again? Now, the pandemic tells us two things, and I'm going to end with that. Number one, since I have been born and since I understand the world, I've never seen Uncle Sam absent from a global crisis like I have seen Uncle Sam absent this time. Uncle Sam is not there anymore. And you don't have champions to champion globalization. And the strongest contender for the position of Uncle Sam has been implicated in the pandemic. So the two big actors who should be underwriting, defending, promoting, and supporting and sustaining global projects are both in some sense perversely implicated by what we've experienced in the last 4 months. So it's an exciting time to be in a think tank. The most important phase of our lives probably is ahead of us. The next 10 years is going to create a whole new template for the rest of the century, and hope we'll partner, Robin, as we've been doing in the past.
Samir, thank you. Both architectural and passionate. And I think your comments there about needing to shed our hypocrisy, but also how to make globalization sexy again, are big rallying calls. Thank you, Samir, for those comments. And a reminder, so I got a question from Neil Carmichael in the Q&A line about is Chatham House reaching outside London at all to these groups? I think both with our SNF CoLab, which is creating more immersive experiences, as you said, ways of communicating long form into the digital era. I think all of us as think tanks are involved in that to our resources capacity, but also even such a London-centric think tank as London, and we're a very London-centric country, as we know we have been. We've been running meetings through our Queen Elizabeth Academy in Liverpool, Bristol, Manchester, Edinburgh, all sorts of places, which we had not done before. So I'm not saying this with pride. It's taken us a long time to get there. But at least, like all think tanks, if we can't learn our lessons, then we're not think tanks. Daniela, let me bring Daniela Schwarzer in now, the director of DGAP, Deutsche Gesellschaft Auswärtige Politik, founded again a little bit as part of the Chatham House family after the Second World War. Daniela, you've been shaking up DGAP since you took over. I'll let you share a few thoughts and then over to Francisco for some last words. And I'm delighted we've got pretty much everyone who was here at the beginning still with us. We'll be going for another 5-10 minutes and then we'll be finished on the half hour, I'm sure. Over to you, Daniela.
Thank you, Robin, and happy birthday. Congratulations for all the great work you're doing. And indeed, DGAP again is another younger sister. We are 65 years old and very much followed the Chatham House model. Let me just pick up one point where I guess we differ, and I would like to follow up on what Samir said, engaging the younger generation and going regional. DGAP has been doing that for now a number of years and quite successfully. And the good news in that is really we run 8 regional chapters entirely based on volunteer work. So our members actually engage and they help us bridge, the geography and bring the conversation to the regions, to the municipalities where they live and work. And this enables us to really reach out to other audiences. They are still all, elite and foreign policy interested, but now we are starting in this year, under the German EU presidency, we are starting the first project where we are using our regional base to reach out to other constituencies who have really nothing much to do with European affairs. And we'll see how that goes, because I entirely share what a number of speakers said before me, that it is very important to engage other constituencies at this point in time. Second comment on the younger generation, again, a piece of good news which really gives me trust in the next generation. 1,000 of our members, that is 1/3, are younger than 35. And again, they work, they basically set up their own program. We help, we support, but this is their thing and they are interested in international affairs. And they bring in, again, new constituencies, many of them young professionals not from the diplomatic service, but in other areas of society. So I think that's the future where we need to go when it comes to DGAP as Chatham House, a member organization. But let me briefly comment on, because this is the part of the conversation where we are supposed to be speaking about geoeconomics, tech, and think tank work. And I'm conscious of time. So let me briefly add a few thoughts to what Samir has been saying on how I see think tank work changing, and what we've been doing around here in Berlin, and where I see the future of the way we think about knowledge generation as a first thing. First of all, this section is supposed to be on tech and geoeconomics, and this brings me to my first point. I think interdisciplinary work is all the more important now for international relations think tanks, who used to recruit their staff from a pretty, I would say, narrow disciplinary background of European affairs, maybe international affairs, maybe security studies. But what I realize by the day is how much we need other disciplines to work with us. And some of them we simply can't recruit into a think tank simply because of the payment levels we have, the salary levels we have in the nonprofit world. But here we need to look into partnerships. For instance, when we work on tech issues, we need specialists who understand the topical areas we work in. They may be in a different professional context, and they work with us. And interestingly, they do this with a great interest. And we have built over the past month a number of partnerships which are extremely fruitful, I believe, for both sides. Secondly, I think we need to really develop our methodological toolkit. We need to learn as think tanks how we work with big data, how we can use cooperation with organizations who work with AI applications to put their instruments to the questions we need to answer in order to see whether we can generate more knowledge and more insights into the very pressing questions we need to answer. And very early on in the discussion, someone said foreign policy is increasingly defined not by governments, but by other actors, and the way international relations evolve. And of course, the private sector is a driver of many, many developments. And what we need to understand as researchers who have as their key goal to advise policymakers in their choices and to provide independent insight is we need to understand how these organizations work and how they think about the future and where they are driving this world. This is particularly true for the area of technology, where really all the fundamental questions we are faced with at the moment have a relevance. Take, for instance, the discussion we have on systemic competition and the future of democracy. If you don't understand the role of technology in all of this, the role of platform economies, the role of, or the way authoritarian leaders are ready to use technological developments, we can have a discussion on the protection of Western liberal democracy, of course, and we can be very normative about it, but we need to understand the mechanics that are going on in other places of the world, and we need to draw conclusions, and sometimes they will be very sober, because in fact, the toolkit for our policymakers will be rather limited in facing that, but we need to be aware. And my final point, how I think think tank work is already changing and will change more in the future in the area of geoeconomics and technology, is we need to involve stakeholders much more and much earlier in our thinking process. So this old idea of researching and then handing out the results and going into a discussion when things are almost ready, I think is past time, at least for some of the issue areas we are covering. And so this, let's say this cooperation very early on in the process is key. And then of course, and this was discussed by others, the communication we need to think of. We need to reach the audiences in the way they consume information at the moment. And this may again be uncomfortable for a think tanker who likes research-based publications, but we need to be ready to be far more flexible in putting out our messages, but always making the offer to provide and deliver sound policy advice based on deep research. But the way we communicate the key messages, of course, has to change over time. Thank you.
Daniela, thank you. Very thoughtful comments, and thanks for being so disciplined on getting them over after so many other comments. Everyone's been able to make something new. I thought your comment about the interdisciplinary aspect is especially important. I mean, I'm conscious, having worked in think tanks most of my life, that specialism, was always what was treasured the most and sought after. And then you end up with buckets of people, each specializing. But as you said, in the kind of world we're in today, you've got to look for those interconnections, and you may not be able to have them all under your roof. Incredibly important. And this issue of not sending information, but letting people take ownership of it and so on, incredibly important as well. And I'll do a shout out for Chatham House members as well, who, like yours, are a third under 30 in our case. But I think your point about getting them to design their own programs was very important as well. Thank you, Daniela. Francisco Santibanez, thank you for being so patient, because we're jumping from Berlin all the way to Buenos Aires just to complete part of this world tour. And a couple of people had asked questions about countries we did not get involved on this. And it's been a challenge, but an absolute pleasure to have so many diverse views. But I'm glad we were able to get as well Cari, the Argentine Council for International Affairs, in with us today. Francisco, you just took over as Secretary General very recently. Argentina, a country that is constantly being buffeted one way or the other economically, but is so close to the heart, both on the Western Hemisphere and in Europe. Why don't you share any thoughts you've got, and then I'll do a wrap up. But over to you, Francisco.
Thank you, Robin. First of all, congratulations for you and Chatham for this first 100 years. Thinking about what's happening in Argentina, my idea would be that one of the things think tanks can do is to give more visibility to challenges that are ignored by the elites, no? Not just politicians, but also in the business community. And Argentina is an example because we are in a crisis, a major crisis, as other times in our history. And society tends to focus on the emergency, no? Short-term solutions. But technological change, economic change is also showing that inequality is growing within states and among the states. And one of the big losers in this will be Latin America. We are seeing this. One example, Latin American kids may lose their entire school year because how hard coronavirus has hit, but also because it coincided with the start of the school year. And this means a loss of human capital and more inequality within our societies and in relation with other countries. So that's, I think, it's an important point to give more visibility to subjects that are not discussed now in Latin America and Argentina in particular, and education is one of those subjects. How to do this? There are some points, some were mentioned already. One thing is to be closer to society, no? It's not just as a way to enlarge our audience, but to understand better the feelings and thinking of society. We may face a credibility crisis as think tanks because we are perceived to be close to the elites. So it will be important for us to be closer to the average citizen to understand, and that will allow us to build bridges and create consensus. A second point, providing accurate information. This was already mentioned. I think it's key. It's still one of our main responsibilities, more now than ever because of social networks. Fake news is one of our most important tasks. Another challenge is to provide an environment, a culture that promotes a free exchange of ideas. This is under threat in many societies. And this is key to have a better products as a think tanks, but also to promote international discussion, to decrease the levels of uncertainty, the levels of conflict. It's very important to have spaces like this one today to share our views. And this will be more important now than ever, more important than in the Cold War, because we are more centered now in international relations and civil society, not just states, and think tanks have an important role to play there. And maybe my last point, very important to be flexible. John mentioned this. as think tanks technological change, we may have to start investing less in real estate and more in technology. We will be able to get closer, as you mentioned, Robin, to people from other parts of our country. This is important in a nation like Argentina, that the elites, the decision makers are in Buenos Aires, a big city. The virtual meetings give us the possibility to be a more national think tank, but also opens other challenges. We will have more competition. It will be easier for think tanks around the world also to be part of the discussion. That's a challenge and an opportunity. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Thank you for wrapping it up and actually still making a key point. I think your point about the intergenerational inequity of the COVID-19 crisis is an incredibly important one to make at the end, and what we can do as a group of institutions to make sure that we're part of the solution rather than the problem, and not be trapped in a way as being seen part of an elite that is not making the difference. So I think it was a very important point to draw to the end. We've gone 15 minutes over. I have to say I was amazed how disciplined everyone had been in their remarks. And as much as I'd hoped to give people a chance to come back in, but I noticed we've got the bulk of the people who were there at the beginning still on this call, because it's been such an interesting conversation. I was going to give, if any one of my colleagues had a last comment they wanted to jump in on, they can literally unmute themselves and make it. But I'm going to count to 3, and if I don't see anyone do it, I'm going to jump in and just share some very last takeaways that I picked up from these remarks. I'm counting to 3. It's sounding silent in the background. You've probably all got other meetings to get to at 1:30. So let me wrap up and say just a few things I took away from this very important call. We are now in a geoeconomic Cold War. Big ideas, over the horizon thinking will be incredibly important at this time. And actually having wider networks of think tanks and making sure that we're open for debate, even with people we disagree with, will be as important. We've got to be careful we don't just become smaller communities at this moment of competition, while sticking, of course, true to our values as think tanks. Second big point, policymaking obviously is not just about governments. John Hamre's opening comment, picked up by many of you since then, it's about civil society, it's about the private sector, but most importantly, it's about an increasingly active and engaged public. How can we help them be an informed and engaged public so that we're going for good ideas becomes incredibly important? And what can we do not to just be seen as part of the elite, but part of the answer? And lastly, how do you run, as Samir Saran said, both the 21st and the 20th century agenda simultaneously? We used to say we're in the 20th and 19th centuries. Now we're in the 20th and 21st at the same time. Interdisciplinary is essential, maybe becoming do tanks, piloting, implementing, sharing. But as Francisco said at the end, and as he said at the end, I'll call him out, keep telling the truth, keep showing the facts, keep playing that core role that we do, whatever our political environment, keep speaking truth to power, as I think was mentioned earlier on. So look, a big thank you for all of you who joined this call, members of Chatham House, who've stuck with us right to the end, a little bit over time, but especially a big thanks to my think tank colleagues who joined us here for our first event in our kind of centenary week. Our first event was 5th of July, 1920. Nice that you were here with us on the 6th of July, 2020 to have this conversation. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing all of my think tank colleagues again, hopefully not just on Zoom, but physically. We can unmute so we can all say goodbye to each other, and thank all of you who joined us and posed lots of good questions. I'm sorry I only got to a few of them. Bye, everyone. See you soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Happy birthday.